August 23rd, 1987, 26-year-old Selonia Reed was found dead in a parking lot of a gas station. Nearly 40 years later, on January 30th, 2023, her husband was sentenced to life in prison for her murder. You do not want to miss this amazing story.
Have you ever felt like giving up, quitting, throwing in the towel? Welcome to Never Ever Give Up Hope featuring Carol Graham. She's an author, health coach, and motivational speaker. Backed into a corner multiple times in her life, Carol shares with you stories on how she overcame some of the toughest obstacles a person can go through in life, but refused to give up hope. Rather than admit defeat, an opportunity was presented, and it involves each and every one of you. Carol will feature spectacular guests who will share their messages of hope, encouragement, and their inspiration to prove why life's adversities only make you stronger. And now, welcoming the host of the show, here's Carol Graham.
Reed recalls the events surrounding the unsolved murder of his mother and the indictment and trial of his father. There have been several times when he has faced difficult situations in his life and felt like there was no solution or no way out. Personal struggles, failures, and challenging circumstances caused him to feel overwhelmed and powerless. But you are going to be inspired and encouraged by what Reggie is going to share with us today. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Carolyn. How are you? Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, I'm glad to have you. I've read your story several times, and I know my audience is going to appreciate the story and that you are passionate about sharing your story. And I'm looking forward to hearing it. Now, you are an author and an accomplished professional in the pharmaceutical industry. You hold a master's degree in business and global marketing, and we are so pleased to have you with us today. Would you please share your story of what happened that day?
All right. Well, thanks again for having me. That day was so long ago, but at times it feels like yesterday when I was
Hmm.
only 6 years old and I woke up and my life, along with my father's life, was turned upside down, if you will.
Hmm.
My mother never came home, hence the title of my memoir. She was found brutally murdered in a parking lot uh, in Hammond, Louisiana, stabbed over a dozen times.
Oh my word.
And yeah, that's that's the gist of what happened to her. And you know, at that point in time, the suspect, the killer, wasn't identified. So just moving on through life, my father, he raised me. He was my rock. We, after time went on, we had to adapt to a new normal of life with it just being him and I, and facing the struggles and
Hmm.
without having my mother and his wife around anymore. And then later, close to almost 40 years later, I get a call. Well, not necessarily 40 years later, but close to almost 30 when I got the call um, that they had reopened the case because the case went
Hmm.
cold. The process with cold cases is, you know, often law enforcement, they reopen these cases and, they just kind of maybe take another trip around the evidence, if you will, to see maybe re-interview people to see if any new leads or new information pops up. So I get a call stating that they have reopened, or not necessarily reopened the case, because the case never was closed.
Oh, okay.
It just was cold. So they basically kind of rehashing things out. And I was like, okay, at that point in time, I was in my early 30s. And my point was that, I had moved. It's not that I didn't want to seek justice or seek whom and what happened to my mother. I just had moved on. And whether I or we found out who was the, killer, or the person who was
Right.
responsible for her murder, it wasn't going to change anything, right? It wasn't going to bring her back.
Of course.
So I was at peace with that. But fast forward 2019, I get a call stating that my father was indicted along with a co-defendant for second-degree murder and conspiracy of my mother.
Oh, my word. What was your first thought?
My first thought was, this can't be real. It felt like a dream. I was working that day. It was like close to the end of the day for me for working, and I get that call, but immediately I was like, oh, something's wrong. Just kind of like brushed it off, because I was like, this can't be right, because I was thinking about the time involved. Like, man, it's been over 30 years. My dad never left town. He was right there. Hammond is a very small town, small community. Everybody knows everybody. My family is quite well known. Have come from a big family, and I was like, my initial thoughts, oh, they got it wrong. This is a mistake. But as time went on, I began to realize that, well, this is not a mistake, and they must have something that calls for them to bring this case to the grand jury and for the grand jury to indict my father. And once he was indicted, this was kind of on the brink of COVID. He was he was in jail for almost a year on a $250,000 bond. And I recall that, this is the brink of COVID, and I was hearing stories of how bad COVID was just in general, but extremely bad in jails and prisons.
Oh, my goodness.
So
yeah.
I had the, discussion with my wife, and we moved some things around financially, and I was able to bond him out of jail. He was out maybe close to maybe a year and a half before trial, because the trial kept getting pushed back and delayed because of COVID. I'm sure if you remember, but the court systems were all backed up.
Right.
They wasn't having court trials. Everything was just kind of backlogged, and it just kept getting pushed back until 2022. The trial finally happened. It was around this time, like the week before Thanksgiving. It was on a Friday, like today.
Huh.
I'm looking at my notes because it's hard for me to remember things these days, but it's actually on a Friday where the verdict came. We started trial that Monday, but the trial ended that Friday, and the verdict came in later that night. And he was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life. That was another traumatic experience that I revisited, as an adult. I felt the same feeling I felt as a 6-year-old by losing one parent.
Oh.
And then later in life, losing another parent, not by death, but it kind of feels like death, That was that, he was taken away in handcuffs, and it was very emotional for me during that moment. And I recall having to drive back to San Antonio the next day, knowing that my dad just got sentenced, well, found guilty. The sentencing hadn't came yet, but I just knew that they were going to
Hmm.
sentence him
Hmm.
to life. But because that's what you get in Louisiana when convicted. So
Now, is there an opportunity for appeal?
yeah, immediately the attorney filed for appeal, um, but there's no real updates on that. And appeals can be very lengthy in
Yes, of
time.
course, of course.
I hate to be Debbie Downer, but it's like a crapshoot,
Oh,
Like,
I get it. I mean, I can't possibly get it, but I hear what you're saying.
yeah, I'm just a realist. I'm like, obviously, it'd be great, but who can say, right?
Do you think it could have been a racial issue?
I think about that. I thought about it. Being from South Louisiana, where it is a lot of racism, but I don't know. I know I talk about that in the book briefly, but I don't know because
It's unanswered, in other words, right?
yeah, it's you have a black man and you have a standing trial for a black mother who was brutally murdered over 30 years ago, and I don't know that all the evidence was circumstantial. There was
That
no
was my next
smoking gun.
question. Okay. That's
There
what I
was
was.
no smoking gun. There was no one that
Huh.
said, "Hey, I saw him drag the body." None of that stuff um, was presented, or no one could testify to that. It was just stories from different individuals that they kind of piece by piece and piece together that allowed them to draw a conclusion to convince the jury that, hey, he's the primary suspect and he's the killer. So I don't know when it comes to, because then I think about like, why did it take so long? It literally was no new evidence that they uncovered versus what they had back then in 87. The only difference was that back then they didn't have the ability to test DNA. And I guess the quote unquote break in the case was this cigarette butt that they found at the crime scene back then. When they found her body, they stored that cigarette butt. They later tested it. It hit on a gentleman by the name of Jimmy Ray Barnes, who was the co-defendant in the case. They located him through the CODIS system because he had been arrested and been convicted of other crimes. They found him, I think, in Atlanta or something. And when they initially approached him, he stated that he was the key to it all in regards to my mother's death. So he basically testified against my dad,
Huh.
saying that, hey, in so many words, he basically said, hey, I didn't do anything. I drove the car to pick up Reggie, which is my dad and I. We have the same
Hmm.
name. I'm
Okay.
junior, he's senior. But he basically said, hey, I just drove the car. I didn't touch. I didn't do anything. And they basically let him off. They gave him time served. And for his testimony, he was out of jail in December, like a month later after the trial, which I totally disagree with, by the way.
And how
That's
did,
that in a nutshell.
yeah, it is I mean, it's a huge story, obviously, and we'll talk about your book in a little bit, but I'm sure as my audience is listening and I am listening, I mean, our heart is going through many emotions. My heart is breaking and trying to imagine what that's like. Can't even begin to imagine it, especially without proof and what you had to go through and dredge up all those memories from when you were a little boy. So basically, my next question is how did you cope? Especially now, how are you coping? And I know that you are an encourager. As I'm listening to your story, and I'm sure the audience as well, as we are hearing your story, and we have many questions, of course, and you don't have the answers. And
Hmm.
that's the worst part, what you have to cope with in not having closure, essentially. And I trust that that'll come at some point and there will be vindication for you. So, how are you coping? What can you share with the audience who are going through something similar and possibly offer some coping skills? Because there's a lot of pain out there and you don't know who you're going to be reaching today. So, what can you share about coping and coping skills?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's definitely not easy to cope with something of this magnitude. I think the first step is acknowledgement of the trauma. No matter what trauma or tragedy that you're faced with, you have to face it head on. You have to acknowledge it and accept it.
Hmm,
'Cause what I've learned is that a lot of people, whether small trauma, big trauma, medium trauma, the natural human response is to reject it and just kind of ignore it and just put it to the side, which I had to learn definitely not the way to overcome it or deal with it, because I like to use the reference, like, try, if you have a wild gorilla in a cage, that's used to being out in his habitat, in his environment, running around in the forest, the woods, or whatever. But then all of a sudden, you put that primate into a cage. Now he's just gonna go crazy. Like, he's gonna be beating his chest, trying to get out, right? But soon as he or she's out, it's like they're free.
hmm,
So I use that analogy when I'm talking about trauma, because you have to let it out. You have to talk about it. And like I mentioned earlier, you have to own it and you have to get to know it, because getting comfortable with the experience that you've been through is the only way where you can essentially overcome it, because at that point, you're realizing that, hey, this happened. I know it happened. There's nothing I can do to change what
right,
happened.
right, right.
I can only change my actions moving forward. So to sum that up, I would just really speak to anybody that's faced with trauma. The first step is to own it.
And the second step?
The second step, after you acknowledge it and own it, is to, have faith. You got to have faith that you can move forward. You got to believe, because trauma can easily affect you in a way that, hey, you know what? This happened. I don't know what to do. I can't move on. And I'm a firm believer in control of controllables.
Hmm,
Some things are out of your control. Some things are in your control. But like in my situation, I couldn't control the trauma that I was faced with, but I can control the outlook I have on it and the steps in which I choose to move forward. Because life is about choices and decisions.
that's right.
And 90% of life is based on how you respond to it, and 10% is based on what happens to you. So it's all about how you respond to things. And that is what gives you the path and the way out from dealing with certain circumstances.
What kind of support have you been able to be for your father?
Well, I still support him, in regards to, like, if he needs commentary, or like money on his books to make phone calls or whatever. I support him in that way, and also mentally,
That's what I
um,
meant, right?
like I don't reject him. Like I still like when he calls, I answer. I think, I believe that's the best way you could support someone in this situation. Now, I've gotten a lot of feedback based on articles that was published about me continuing to maintaining the relationship with my father. You know, people people read stuff these days. They just look at things at the surface level,
Of
and
course. Yep.
they're like, "Oh, it's no way I can ever talk to a person who did this to my mom."
Mm,
Blah blah blah. And that's easy to say, right? But if you're in my shoes, it's not. Or if you're dealing with something of this magnitude, it's not so easy because think about it. My dad raised me.
mm-hmm,
He raised
mm-hmm,
me. He was a good dad. He was a good father. Like he provided the best way he could. We had a good relationship. He actually he actually taught me what I know,
right,
like
right.
he helped me become the man that I am today. He could have easily threw his hands up and said, I can't do this.
Mm-hmm.
I could have been easily raised by a family member, my grandmother, my grandparents, or what have you, but he continued to raise me. That's something I just can't ignore based on, what he was convicted of. And if all that is true, at the end of the day, from a spiritual aspect of the equation, I'm not the end decision maker on that.
Mm-hmm.
I can only just do my part and do what I feel comfortable with. And I feel comfortable with continue to maintain that relationship with him and talking to him and when he calls. The best thing I can do right now, and it's nothing that will change that.
And I'm sure it's appreciated very much by him.
Well, yeah, and he still maintains his innocence. I think one of his worst fears for me to think or believe
Mm,
he had anything to do with
mm-hmm.
it. In all transparency, looking at the evidence that was laid out during trial and all the discovery, it doesn't look good, right? Um, and I believe that he may have had something to do with it. The one thing I struggle with is if he physically did it. Because again, not saying that one murder or one death is worse than the other, but
Mm-hmm.
my mother's murder, it was brutal. It was very intentional. It wasn't just that she was shot. It was very intentional and basically killed in the manner of like rage or passion.
Hmm.
So, and it's just hard for me to think like my dad would have I don't know. I just can't put him as committing such a gruesome act. But like I mentioned, looking at the evidence, looking at the life insurance policies, and looking at the statements and everyone who came to trial and testified against him, hey, like I said, it doesn't look good. It looks a little fishy. I don't know.
Well,
I
this
still
is
don't have the closure that I
right.
wish
Okay.
I
That,
would
yeah, I'm
have. You
hearing
know what I
that.
mean?
I'm hearing that. And hopefully that will come. But even if it never does, it's to me you are a strong man who has dealt with an incredible situation, and you come out wanting to help and support others in what they're going through, and however you can help them. And that I believe you're doing through your memoir and in other ways, of course, as well. So we're going to take a quick 30-second break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about your memoir. We'll be right back.
Carol Graham would like to show you the path from misery to miraculous triumph in her fast-paced memoir, Battered Hope. She relates her determination to succeed as someone who experienced one horrendous nightmare after another. Gang raped and left for dead, loss of a child, husband falsely imprisoned, and cancer. Nothing could break her tenacity or faith. No matter what you face, heartache, loss, suffering, or injustice, Carol will illustrate how she became a victor the same way you can. The secret is to never, ever give up hope. Order your copy at Amazon or batteredhope.blogspot.com.
Somebody said something to me many years ago that I have never forgotten, and that was, grief is a constant companion. And listening to your story today, Reggie Reed, I believe that that is what you can attest to. That grief is your constant companion. It never is gone. There's always something in the background. And it's not that you are hoarding any bad feelings or anything else. It is just there. It has made you who you are. And as a result, too, in listening to your story, I can see you as an encourager. And your passion of sharing your story comes across as well with your compassion is coming through because you have been there. And now we want to talk about your book and how it has helped others and whatever you want to share about your story. What was the name of the book again?
My memoir is titled "The Day My Mother Never Came Home."
Oh my goodness, that's impactful. And who should buy your book? Tell us about it. Is it just the story or whatever you would like to share about it?
I want to say it really doesn't have a strict targeted audience.
Okay.
But what I've seen, that it attracts two different types of people or
Okay.
readers.
Okay.
One is the true crime population, because as you know, true crime is very, very popular.
Yes.
A lot of people like true crime stories. You know, it's really a big genre when it comes to books and TV shows, etc. So it does attract significantly that category of readers. But secondarily, and really my purpose was to really have impact on people that have dealt with trauma or is currently dealing with trauma. Because again, this is not to sound braggadocious or anything like that, but to be where I'm at and being faced with that trauma early on in life and then ongoing throughout my life.
Right.
And then later as an adult, I could have easily took another path. Easy.
That's right. That's a good point.
I was having this conversation a couple months ago with someone, and I said, you know what, if I would, because again, just a little background, I didn't grow up, or I wasn't raised like with a silver spoon. We came from humble beginnings. We lived in a not so good neighborhood, a lot of drugs, crime, not so much, but it just wasn't your typical Full House or Family Matters neighborhood, right? I'm referring to one of the
Gotcha.
sitcoms.
Yes, I hear that.
You know what I mean? It was, they call it the hood, right? So I was surrounded by drugs and, things that I could have easily just latched on to and took another path in life. Or ended up on some type of drug and just
Mm-hmm.
been involved in the wrong thing. And if that would have been the course that I decided to take, you know what? I would have been excused. And what I mean by that is people would have looked at me and said, this is why he ended up like that. And basically gave me a
Oh, okay,
pass.
right. Yep.
I would have been handed a pass to be messed up. Like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
they were like, look, his mom was murdered and this and that. So, that's why he's on drugs, or that's why he's an alcoholic, or that's why he's all in and out of jail, because he's torn, So I say all that to say that, like I mentioned earlier, life is about choices, life is about decisions. And I chose not to go that route. And those are the people that I really want to impact, because it's people out there that's dealing with trauma that may not be as significant as mine, and they go off the deep end.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
It could
Good
be
point.
a breakup, it could be a layoff at a job, it could be divorce, it could be, anything. All that is trauma in my book, and all that's
Mm-hmm.
considered trauma, right? Different levels. And you hear these stories all the time that people just go off the deep end, and those are the people I really want to touch and inspire, and use my trauma as a baseline and say, listen, if I went through this, again, not bragging, because
I
look,
understand.
I
Mm-hmm.
don't wish this on anyone, but if I went through this and came out okay, you can do it too. You can do it too.
Excellent. Excellent.
So that's one of my key goals. If I could just help one person, I'm not here to sell 1,000,000 books. If 1,000,000 people bought the book, great, right? But that one person, if I could help that one person who really just read my book, read my story, and it gave them some motivation to say, you know what, I'm not going to go down that path, because Reggie didn't. And he dealt with a lot, things worse, much worse than what I'm dealing with. So I'm going to change my trajectory. But I'll feel like my goal has been accomplished.
Well, that is like your mission. And as I said earlier, it stems from compassion. Because of what you went through, you want to help somebody else and to help them look at things possibly from a different perspective and not go into the blaming mode or the guilt mode or any other places. The self pity would be huge, but you definitely have not gone those routes, and I applaud you for that. And I am so excited and anxious to share your story. Like you said, true crime is a huge genre, and I just so happy that you shared your story today. And I know the audience is going to respond favorably. So, in closing, is there anything else that you would like to share or encourage or anything else you want to talk about?
No, I just really want to encourage anybody listening to this podcast to follow the title of your podcast, Never Give Up Hope, because I think that's the anchor in getting to the next step and getting on the right path to overcome trauma.
Oh, I like that. The anchor. That's so well said. Thank you. And thank you, Reggie, for being on Never, Ever Give Up Hope.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Never Ever Give Up Hope, featuring Carol Graham. Did you know that most people succeed because they are determined to? Quitting was never an option. Carol loves your comments and will respond to each one. So please subscribe and review this podcast. A rating of 5 stars would be outstanding and appreciated. Remember, if you are still here, there is always hope.